welcome to this afternoon session, and welcome to all the people who are just arriving, who were not here this morning. We're happy to have you, and welcome to the people who went to the library, who are, I guess, watching this on camera. There are seats up front and on the sides. And you will all be very happy to know that around 2 o'clock we are going to take a break no matter what I'm talking about, because none of us can go till 3:30 without that. Okay. Okay, I'm very, very happy that we are all in the same room and I have a chance to talk to you about dyslexia. Just in the way of a little bit of background about how come I'm even up here talking to you about dyslexia. I myself am not a dyslexic person, and I do not have any children who are dyslexic, so it took me a while in my professional career. I was well into my 30s and into my doctoral program before I understood anything about what dyslexia was and how it affected people. I had been a teacher, I had been a curriculum director, I had been an education specialist in neuropsychology, and then I was a doctoral student, as you heard this morning, at the Harvard Ed School. And about 2 or 3 years into my doctoral program, a person who directed a school for students with dyslexia outside of Boston came to me and invited me to come to a meeting of the International Dyslexia Association. And I thought, gosh, should I go incognito? I don't know if I want to be seen around all these weirdos who talk about this weird thing. I am a learning disability specialist. And that it changed my life. I started hearing from the best researchers in the country about language and reading. I heard Isabel Liberman talk at an IDA conference. I heard Keith Stanovich and Linda Siegel, who were arguing at the time that we shouldn't be using IQ discrepancies to identify reading disabilities. I heard Linnea Erie talk about the progression of how we learn to read, and at that time she was unknown and was fighting battles at the University of California in Davis, trying to get her papers published on how we actually learn to read. I visited a school where I actually saw kids who couldn't read and who were working very, very hard at it under the tutelage of very skilled teachers who knew how to explain concepts that I had never heard of in my 10, 12-year professional life. So after that, I am now an Orton Oak, and that means that I've been a member of the IDA for more than 25 years. And counting. And I can readily say that although I did get that doctorate from Harvard, I would say that my real education has come from IDA meetings, from hearing researchers, from talking to teachers, talking to parents, and it's been a critical aspect of my own professional life. And the other experience I had that enables me to talk about this in with some kind of enlightenment is my clinical experience, much more than my research experience, but my clinical experience working with students who were referred for difficulties of all ages and all walks of life, and sitting across from them for 4 to 5 hours at a stretch, giving them all kinds of tests and watching them and listening to them and listening to their families. And that added up to at least 2,000 subjects or clients in the time that I was in clinical practice after I finished my doctoral work. So I care deeply about this issue, and I care deeply that you all are here in this room together to contemplate what we know. It amuses me almost that even the term dyslexia is still controversial after I have bookshelves filled with scientific texts on dyslexia. I subscribe to journals with the title Dyslexia in them. I go to the Scientific Studies of Reading conference where many sessions have the word dyslexia in them, and still we have the National Association of School Psychologists that advises school psychologists not to use the term. I think that needs to change. Okay, so let me make a case for you. Of course, I have to get this thing to work. Oh, I have to turn it on. Okay. Okay, I want to talk to you about some issues with definition, etiology, that is what the causes of dyslexia might be, a few of the findings about the brain and the neurobiological aspects of dyslexia. Certainly going to talk about aspects of treatment or instruction that are critical for a person with dyslexia. I hope to bring into this talk the necessity for compassionate treatment and understanding of this condition and what that means in practice, give you some resources, and to have some time at the end for questions, and I'm sure you will have many. Okay, I'd like to start by introducing you to one of the clients that I had in those years when I was a clinical practitioner in rural Vermont. This young man, whose name was Dante, was referred to me at age 19. He was a postgraduate student at a sort of minor prep school in New England. And it was the curriculum director at the school who referred him to me. Because that curriculum director was aware of the significance of what he was seeing. So here was this student who, on IQ testing, achieved a verbal IQ of 128. But here's the remarkable thing. In advanced conceptual physics, he had earned high honors at this school. But his SAT essay and written expression was very low. Score was 380, which is really low, especially if you have a verbal IQ of 128. And his reading score was at the 17th percentile. 17th percentile. He had been retained in second grade. He was still trying to make it through high school. And I looked back over his school records, and repeatedly, especially in the early grades, the teachers would say that he needed to try harder. He was careless. He did not put effort into his work. And he was never evaluated. But it struck me that there was a contradiction between a student who would earn high honors in advanced conceptual physics, which to me is incomprehensible, and who would be reading at the 17th percentile, which is well within the risk range, or the range that researchers consider to be very poor reading, and that his teachers would describe him as careless. So why would they describe him as careless? So here we got a little essay from Dante. And this is just a paragraph from it, from his writing sample. The regular students are socially retarded. Notice the spelling. They live, notice that he doesn't know whether it's F or V in that word, live sheltered lives. Now he puts an F where there should be a V. The school dances consist, and notice the confusion there, of a DJ and everyone but the PGs standing along the wall. The regular students talk constantly about classes. Some of the PGs that lived close by started throwing dance parties on the weekends to make some extra money once the regular prep school students showed up and went into culture shock, SCHOCK, and had to leave. The regular students notice this, 2 A's in the word at. The regular students at Worcester hate the PGs, but we make up the football, notice the letter confusion, basketball, missing, and baseball teams. The other students are some of the most non-athletic people I have ever seen. And notice athletic, right? Now, the fact that his teachers, for all these years, attributed those kinds of errors to carelessness, to me is very puzzling. Because I have known many careless students who never make errors like that, who would not put 2 A's in the word at, who would not confuse the words life and live if they had a IQ of 128. So this struck me as, of course, a case of undiagnosed something, and the word for it is dyslexia. You cannot account for those kinds of symbolic confusions by saying the person is careless or not putting in an effort. The students who are trying very hard may still make those errors because they cannot regulate the signals between their brain and their hand, what is coming out on the paper. And they may not have accurate orthographic memories for what these words are in the first place, and they're certainly not noticing when they try to write a word like athletic that the letters they have written don't correspond to the speech sounds in the word. This condition, which, Dante was 19, he had never been diagnosed. His problem had never been accurately described. He had never had systematic instruction in basic skills. And finally, when he heard that there was a label for these sorts of problems and was shown his test results, he literally burst into tears in my office. And he said, I never had anyone say to me anything other than that I was careless and that I didn't care. This condition has been documented, yes, in the medical literature, but it doesn't mean that it's a medical diagnosis. Just because there were physicians who first documented the nature of the disorder in individuals with known neurological conditions, that doesn't mean that dyslexia is somehow the province of the medical profession. The disorder was recognized as early as 1877, as soon as there was a medical literature, and the term word blindness was used for adults with acquired brain injuries that prevented them from recalling the words that they once had known. And in this first paper by Cosmall, he was either Austrian or German, I'm not sure. He wrote about the individual having normal sight, normal intelligence, normal ability to understand language, but inability to recognize print. And then, of course, Pringle Morgan wrote a paper in 1896 describing the whole developmental disorder in a younger student, I think it was about 10, and his history of being unable to recognize print. Of course, there's a long history of other physicians writing about this condition called dyslexia. The papers of Norman Geschwind, the papers of Samuel Orton, all these people were medical researchers, but the sort of blossoming of educational research around dyslexia and around the nature of reading disorders came really in the beginning of the 1970s through the efforts of the National Institutes of Health to understand the relationship between basic speech processing and the ability to read. So since that time, we have accumulated an enormous body of research about reading disability and dyslexia and the relationship between dyslexia and other kinds of learning disorders. So what does the word mean? It means difficulty with language. And for that reason, I like the term better than the term reading disability, because the term reading disability leads people to think that the disorder is only having to do with reading. Whereas if you use the term dyslexia, difficulty with language, difficulty with words, what you're conveying is the larger meaning of the relationship between reading and language functions. People who have trouble reading have difficulty with one or more critical language functions that underlie the translation of print into speech. So for that reason, the term is better than the term reading disability, because it conveys the breadth of the disorder and the nature of the disorder better than the term reading disability. But it is synonymous with the reading disability that is still described in DSM-5. The condition is hereditary in the sense that if there is a strong family predisposition for dyslexia, the chances of someone's children experiencing dyslexia are high, but it's not a given that every child in a family with a genetic history is going to be dyslexic, nor is it a given that you must have a family history of dyslexia to experience these difficulties. And the last paper I just read about this suggested that about half the cases of students who present with dyslexia have a clear biological predisposition by virtue of genetics, and about half really don't. So if there is a family history and a parent comes to you and says, look, I couldn't learn to do this, my husband couldn't learn, my grandfather never got out of second grade, would you please take a careful look at my child? You should say, yes, we'll really monitor your child's progress. The neurobiological aspects of dyslexia are still being unraveled and studied, but definitely there are clear associations between dyslexia and differences in brain activation and brain functions and even brain architecture in some cases. The condition is developmental and chronic. It's not something that people outgrow. It's something they may overcome. It's something they may compensate for. It's something they may learn in spite of, but it is always there. How many students are affected depends on what study you look at. The Mayo Clinic did a prevalence study a few years ago, and they came up with a figure of 11% of the population. The Yale Center for Learning Disabilities tends to estimate a higher proportion of the population. They've said 17 to 20%, which I think means that they're including a lot of individuals in the category who are relatively higher functioning than the kids who make it into special ed, but who nevertheless show all these symptoms of difficulty decoding print. The World Health Organization also says that about approximately 10% of the population experiences the symptoms of dyslexia. The most commonly cited definition is from a paper by Lyon, Shaywitz, and Shaywitz from 2003, which you can readily find on the International Dyslexia Association website or download and handout. And the critical descriptors that are consistent with other definitions that are accepted across the world are that dyslexia is one of several different kinds of reading difficulties, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It is characterized by poor decoding and encoding, or poor decoding and spelling, poor word recognition and spelling. And the main thing that is central to any definition is that there are problems with accurate and or fluent printed word recognition. That has to be there for this diagnosis to be correct. The experience of the person in trying to learn to read is inconsistent with their age or cognitive ability. And what I have not put on the list here is a little more difficult to describe, but there's the qualitative aspect of struggle when the person looks at print and tries to make sense out of it. So the difficulty with fluency and accuracy is associated with the person feeling overloaded and stressed by the activity itself, the person being often tense, the person being frustrated, the person not knowing why reading the word do, D-O, is so difficult for them when it should be so simple because there are only two little letters there on the page. The difficulty of dyslexia, and I put this in bold, is often, I did not use the word always, is often associated with difficulty identifying, manipulating, or producing the speech sounds in spoken words. Okay, that's the phonological aspect of dyslexia that is in the definition we often cite. But there are other definitions that do not emphasize or require that the individual demonstrate explicit difficulties with phonological awareness or phonological processing as you would measure it on something like the CTOP, the clinical test for phonological processing. For example, I like this description. There are many other countries that have adopted definitions. We're not the only one. And the World Health Organization has a definition, and they've had it for a long time before we put the word dyslexia in our special ed law. So I like this. Dyslexia is present when the automatization of word identification and or word spelling does not develop or does so very incompletely or with great difficulty. That's the qualitative aspect I'm talking about. The term automatization refers to the establishment of an automatic process. A process of this kind is characterized by a high level of speed and accuracy. It's carried out unconsciously, makes minimal demands on attention, and is difficult to suppress, ignore, or influence. So if you're a good reader and I show you a word in print, it's very difficult for me to prevent you from making an instant recognition of that word. There's something called the Stroop test that we use to demonstrate this in neuropsychology, where you show people words printed in different colors and you ask them to name the colors, and if they can read, they get all tripped up because they're automatically reading the words. And it's hard for them to shift away from that and read the colors instead. So I like this particular definition because it doesn't talk about phonological processing. It talks about the qualitative aspect of the failure to develop automatization of what for most of us is relatively easy to get once we get sufficient practice. And for some of us, it's a breeze. We were reading at age 4. Dyslexia is a spectrum disorder. And I have colleagues in the research community who are fond of saying that the analogous condition from a medical standpoint is obesity. Because if you follow the literature, which is plentiful now, on obesity in our society, there are debates, for example, about where we have a cutoff point where we say that somebody is clinically obese, or we say they're just overweight, or we say that they are likely to have a real health problem, it's likely to interfere with their functioning in life, versus it's just likely to be inconvenient, versus it's really okay and the person's going to be perfectly healthy anyway. And there are debates about that, and we continue to try to figure it out. So there are cutoff scores that are arbitrarily drawn. There are distributions of physical characteristics when we start talking about obesity that are sort of arbitrarily and somewhat scientifically cited as being related to this problematic condition. There are multiple causes, as there are with dyslexia. And there are complex cause-effect relationships with both of these conditions, where you cannot cite any one specific gene or any one specific neurological signature or any one specific profile on testing. And also the treatments that are recommended vary in their effectiveness with different individuals, and that is also the case for dyslexia. So this is much more complicated than we want to think at times. There is overlap between dyslexia and ADHD. Eric Treatise, who is the president of the IDA currently, is a developmental pediatrician. He's written a nice little book summarizing these relationships. But basically, you can say rule of thumb is a quarter of the kids with ADHD will also be dyslexic, and that in the population of dyslexic kids, 12 to 24% have diagnosable ADHD, and a lot of them have sort of subclinical attentional problems and, of course, working memory problems, which seem to go with the same package. Now, the 4-part processing system, I showed this morning, and I'm going to resurrect it here because it's important to understand that what the brain has to do to read is recruit neurological wherewithal from centers in the brains that were never designed originally, or in evolutionary terms, to do this thing that we call reading. These areas of the brain, the phonological processor is specialized for speech processing. The orthographic processor is specialized for pattern recognition and for really for word recognition, but we've had to recruit a sort of neurological wherewithal to build up this area of the brain for storing images of printed words. The meaning processor is our lexicon, or our mental dictionary, where we store the meanings of words and file them according to relationships with other words usually. And this context processor is a whole language system, this morphosyntactic system that we use to select meanings for words when we read them in context. And all of these systems have to be coordinated through very rapid communication. They all have to be intact for proficient reading to take place. So what does that mean? It means that there are all these different ways that reading can go wrong, right? If there are miscommunications between any of these centers, if any of these centers are themselves not wired well, if the efficiency of the whole system is somehow impaired, we can get a reading problem. So I also showed this morning, that physiologically, the speech processing centers, or the phonological processor, is in the base of the frontal lobe, the green area on the slide. The orthographic processing center is posterior in the occipital area of the brain, and where we have to build connections is in between. We have to build pathways from these visual orthographic centers to the phonological processing centers in order to even connect sounds and symbols, or to learn phonics, to use an alphabetic orthography, and that's what that blue area is. That blue area is artificially constructed through practice, through exposure, through instruction. And it takes a lot of kids a long time to activate and really build pathways and a word recognition center where all this comes together. The reading rope that I talked about this morning shows that over time, fluent reading develops as a consequence of many sub-skills that we've been able to identify through research. This is an image created by Hollis Scarborough, an eminent cognitive developmental scientist who studied reading for years and who's tried to demonstrate how each of these strands are related to one another as reading develops over time. So one of the main things to notice, if you didn't see this morning, is that there are two, what we call, in the simple view of reading, two big areas that, or skill areas that operate to support fluent reading. One is language comprehension, and that's made up of background knowledge of the topic you're reading about, vocabulary, or the knowledge of the specific word meanings in the text, knowledge of language structures, particularly syntax or sentence structure, ability to reason and follow the logic of a passage and make inferences, and then knowledge of the structure of text and what to expect when you pick up a book. If you're reading a textbook, you read it one way. If you're reading a James Joyce novel, you read it another way, I hope. And then the second major area is the word recognition area, or rather, the first major area is the word recognition area, and that includes strands for phonological awareness, for decoding or knowing sound symbol correspondences, or phonics, and automatic recognition of whole words, which on this diagram is called sight recognition. Sight recognition doesn't mean just recognizing words that are irregularly spelled. It means automatic recognition. Thinking back to that definition from the Netherlands, it's the automatization process in word recognition that's represented by that lower strand. All of these strands represent aspects of language. Reading is a quintessential language-based skill. Starting in, 1977, Frank Valentino wrote a paper called something like Reading is Not Visual. It was in the Harvard Educational Review, and it created quite a stir because up until that time, even the term word blindness implicates the visual system much more than the language system. But now it is pretty clear to us that language and language problems are the main issue when it comes to reading disability, but within that, there are different types of reading disabilities depending on which of these language systems is the one or ones most prominently involved in the problem. And we know from our definition that phonological deficits characterize the group as a whole. So for example, if you look at the data, and this is also in the Fletcher, Lyon, Fuchs, and Barnes book on learning disabilities, and also in a number of papers published on the Connecticut longitudinal study. If you look at the profiles across psychological tests of students with reading disabilities, some of whom have IQ achievement discrepancies, and some of whom have no discrepancies between IQ and achievement, the profiles are quite similar and show that the big dip down there is on phonological awareness. That was the marker test, if you will, in this population of kids at second and third grade level across subtests of the Woodcock-Johnson and other supplementary tests that were used at the time to show the profile of kids with reading disabilities and to show that IQ discrepancies did not really matter when you looked at the fundamental profile of kids with reading disabilities. Now that phonological awareness deficit, again, I have to say, characterizes a group. These are group composite scores. And what I'm running into now is the mistaken idea that a group trend should represent every individual, or every individual who gets this diagnosis should somehow reflect the group trend, which is not the case. These are composite scores of they followed 400 and some kids, and I'm not sure exactly how many are in this profile. I'm sorry, I have to look that up. Okay, but what were they measuring? They were looking at whether or not the kids could detect the phonemes in the speech sound stream. So as I said this morning, if you say to a kid, what's the first sound in cat? And they say meow, you know that they have no idea what you're asking them to do. If I ask you to say sigh backwards, what would you get? Ice. Very good. So you cannot think about the letters, you have to think about the sounds. I, if you turn it around, becomes I-s. If you say most, and now say motes, what two sounds have changed in their order? Okay, the t and s have changed in their order. If I ask that of a dyslexic person, they will look at me blankly, usually. What is the third phoneme in sling? I, right, or closer to E, correct, right? And how many phonemes are in this word, box? 4. Okay, you all are very smart. You're much smarter than most of the audiences I talk to. Good for you, okay? Now, some people will say, if you ask that of a dyslexic person and they know how to spell box, they may say there are 3 sounds. If you ask that of a teacher who has never had any instruction in phonology, they will also say there are 3 sounds. So part of this is acquired knowledge. But what happens when you have a student with a phonological problem is that they will have other sorts of difficulties that are readily apparent if you just work with them and talk with them a little bit. They will confuse words that have a similar phonological structure, and they will mix up the sounds and the syllables, or have trouble repeating words that they haven't heard before, and confuse phrases such as further than the truth when they mean or further from the truth. I see those sorts of confusions a lot in our public figures and our sports announcers too. I showed this morning, but I want to show it again for you who are new, which is that when we recognize a whole word, we think we're reading the whole word as a unit. But if you look at what the brain activation pattern is for someone who can read, we can see now through the work of Jane Ashby and her colleagues, and through the work of Rayner and Polachek and other people who've done eye movement studies and tracked what and connected them with fMRI studies and so on, that if you are a good reader, all of these layers of language either are activated or can be activated very, very fast as necessary. So if you misread the word, if you read it as unteachable instead of unreachable, you will instantly back up and say, oh, that base word is teach, it's not reach. But your brain is telling you about the meaningful parts, about the syllables, about the phoneme, grapheme correspondences, and about the individual letters that make up that letter string. So to learn to read, and to learn to read that word as a whole, what you've done is gradually build up competence from the recognition of individual letters to phoneme, grapheme correspondences, then to syllable patterns, then to morphology or the meaningful parts of words, and then, as Linnea Erie describes, you unitize those aspects of word knowledge into what seems to be the recognition of a whole word, or the memory for a whole word. It is very common that you'll see in lectures on dyslexia a slide that looks like this. The Shawitzes, for example, use a slide like this, if not this one, that's kind of in the circuit. And the common characterization is that the roadblock in dyslexia is between the time the person looks at a text and their ability to recognize individual words. And it's generally assumed that the other things that reading depends on, such as general intelligence, vocabulary, reasoning skills, and concept formation, are all just fine. But the reality is that when you really look at the data on the distributions of characteristics in the population of people with reading disorders, it looks more like this: a series of overlapping continua, if you will, that have to do with phonological processes, that have to do with orthographic processes, and that have to do with language comprehension. Some of the newer books and papers that discuss this, the most recent article in Scientific Studies of Reading, for example, by Maggie Snowling and a couple of her colleagues. This is the latest thing I just read that I got on this slide, where she is very explicit about multiple overlapping and varying distributions of skills in these three areas, and the fact that only some kids have all these problems, some kids have just this, some kids have a very pronounced problem here, and some have a very pronounced problem there. And some have very pronounced problems getting these associated, but don't have any problem with language comprehension. So they come in all these different packages. And then the question for us is going to be, okay, who do we use the word dyslexia for? And there's no simple answer that everyone has agreed on, but I will try to make my case for you. I'm often asked why we would do something as silly as ask students who are being screened for reading problems to read nonsense words. And teachers sometimes have a visceral reaction. And not just that, I just saw an article in a prominent newspaper about a board member in Tennessee who decided single-handedly that students in that state should not have to read nonsense words. And they're throwing out all the screening tests. Well, some people are fighting with her, but because it's counterintuitive. If you want kids to read for meaning, why would you even bother with nonsense words? Well, there's a scientific reason, and the first long paper we had about this was published 20 years ago by Richard Olson, called The Non-Word Reading Deficit in Dyslexia. in Reading Research Quarterly, I think, in which he showed that kids with phonologically based reading disabilities had particular pronounced problems reading nonsense words, and it was a marker of the condition. Why would that be the case? Because in order to read nonsense words, you have to be able to connect these processing systems rapidly and automatically. And you have to know how the print system represents speech. So what purer measure of that aspect of reading than asking kids to read nonsense words? Have fun with those. I won't ask you to read them all out loud. So it has become, well, let me go back to that one. I also put in the title that poor nonsense word decoding is very common, but it is not universal. If you buy into the latest conceptualizations of reading disabilities, and you buy into the idea that some people with severe reading difficulties may have a very specific problem with something we call orthographic processing, or just the automatization of recognition of words in print, it is conceivable and possible that people could have a fine time with phoneme segmentation and do fine on the C-top and whatever test you're using and still not be able to read. Okay? What I'm finding, this is not universally appreciated, but okay, let's go on. So what about another idea that we need to examine closely? Is dyslexia associated with giftedness? If you go to IDA conferences, there will always be somebody speaking about giftedness and dyslexia, which kind of promotes the idea that if you're dyslexic, you have unusual gifts in some area. And so the claims are that if you're dyslexic, you have a special gift, that you have some kind of visual or artistic or entrepreneurial superiority. That's another idea that's advanced in certain circles. But the reality is this: if you look at the statistics, in the early stages of reading, there is a very low correlation between intelligence and reading, especially nonverbal intelligence. So for example, if you're a psychologist and you're giving a test of nonverbal intelligence, I just have to ask you, why are you doing that? It's not going to tell you anything at all about whether the student is at risk for reading and spelling. It might tell you something about a strength that you want to discover, but it is not associated with reading and spelling. So if the student is really good at drawing geometric figures or really good at block design on the whisk, that gives you no information at all about the nature of the student's reading. It has nothing to do with it. It may tell you that the student is wired up to be an engineer sometime in the future, which is valuable to know, but it is not related to reading and spelling. And if you are unconvinced, you need to look at the standardization data for the WISC or any other intelligence test you use and look at the correlations between these IQ scores and the academic achievement tests that are used for concurrent validation. So think of it as independence. And if you think of it as independence of variables, then it's certainly possible that people can be very gifted at certain things and still be terrible at reading. It's also possible that students can be very limited intellectually and not have any particular pronounced talents and be very good at reading, in the sense of being able to read the words. Now, I will qualify this by saying that there is some evidence, I think it's a little shaky, that some individuals who are dyslexic, when they process visual information will take in more information in their peripheral vision than people who are good readers. But what we don't know is whether that's a function of lifelong learning, whether it's a function of not being able to read versus being able to read, whether the brain has been trained in a certain way. We just don't know. Was Einstein dyslexic? Well, I read all 1,000 pages of the Walter Isaacson biography on Einstein, his life and universe, and there was no mention in any paragraph of Einstein being dyslexic in any way whatsoever. This is a myth that's been promoted because we like to think that it's a way of sort of validating that people with dyslexia can have special talents, but it's just inaccurate, and we need to let go of it. Einstein was not dyslexic, and I have quoted, he was slow learning how to talk. Whenever he had something to say, he would try it out on himself, so he was odd. I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and he was still alive, and he would be walking down the street in sandals and shorts in the middle of the winter with his long, wild gray hair, and everybody would drive by and say, "That's Einstein, that's Einstein." And so this biography says, throughout his life, Einstein had a mild form of echolalia, causing him to repeat phrases to himself, especially if they amused him. He had a cheeky rebelliousness toward authority. Well, he was a lot smarter than his teachers. He generally preferred to think in pictures, most notably in famous thought experiments. All of his discoveries came just his thought experiments. He'd wander in the woods and he thought up quantum physics. He thought about it. He figured it out. In primary school, he was at the top of his class. There's no mention of reading or spelling a difficulty in his biography. However, people with learning disabilities of all kinds certainly can have disparate talents. And we have many examples of those that reflect the dissociation between reading, spelling, and other talents in life. So Picasso, Churchill, Agatha Christie, Philip Schultz, and I'm going to read to you from his biography later, Greg Louganis, Jim Dutcher, who's a friend of mine, eminent wildlife photographer, works with the National Geographic, has made documentaries for Discovery Channel, talks to me about his dyslexia. He cannot read. He can't pronounce my name. Simon Pierce, the glassblower, also an acquaintance of mine, who has 4 dyslexic sons and one with Down syndrome. Whoopi Goldberg, and so on. So we have lots of examples of that. So the message here is, yes, a person with dyslexia can have exceptional talents, and we need to discover them and nurture them. And I think the best reason for comprehensive evaluations is to locate what those talents are, rather than to explain a reading disability, is to explain what else there is to know about the person that shows promise and possibility that they themselves may not be aware of. Scores, these are standard scores based on grade, I think. It's a composite score, 72 at the 3rd percentile on the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test. This kid could not read. And this is the old WISC. This is out of my files from a while back because it's such a clear-cut case of a certain kind of dyslexic kid. So verbal IQ of 80 and performance IQ of 105, and if you take out the coding test, it was 117. And the red box on this shows what's considered to be the average range, right? So on these performance or nonverbal tests, he's way up here on almost everything except symbol coding, and on the verbal tests, which are heavily loaded with language, he's below this average range on just about everything. Vocabulary is on the scale score of 9, 37th percentile. A very dramatic profile in what's considered to be a sort of classic case of a language-based reading disorder. But he had a speech and language evaluation, and he didn't score low enough to qualify for special ed in speech and language because he scored at the 10th percentile on the SELF, which was too high to qualify for speech and language services. And the SLP said that he had pronounced weaknesses in explaining word meanings, recognizing multiple meanings of words, comprehending spatial and temporal word classes and categories, and formulating complete sentences with conjunctions. He did not know the months of the year or calendar concepts, even though he was, let's see, I think 9 years old and entering 3rd grade. His spelling errors, you cannot see this, so what I did was you can just see what his spelling test looked like, and then I wrote whether it was correct or incorrect and wrote the words here. You can't really see, so I wrote it out here. On his spelling test, in which he scored at the 8th percentile, which is very low, he confused the short vowels ah and eh. So for let, he wrote L-A-T. For next, N-A-S-T. Spend, S-P-A-N-D. Myself, everyone, so on. So 5 errors of the same kind. And then he omitted nasal consonants before final stop consonants pronounced in the same place in the mouth. So he omitted the N before T in went. He omitted the ng before the K in uncle. He omitted the N before T in 19. So in this one limited sample, 3 errors of the same kind. He messed up on the R in storm. He confused S and ch, which are both the voiceless sounds. One's a fricative, the other's an affricate, but they have some properties in common. And he didn't know the consonant LE spelling pattern, for example. So what was the nature and severity of this student's problem? I guess I've already given it away. Okay, he had a mixed or triple deficit reading disability in that his language comprehension was affected, his phonological processing was affected, and his orthographic memory for words was poor for both word recognition and for spelling. And why wasn't it identified sooner? Well, these were the days before RTI. We did not have a universal screening. We just retained kids to see if they would grow out of it, like we did with, not we, the system did with Sam, giving him no help. Even though when kids have no behavior problems, it's much less likely that they're going to get attention for anything. Who should be responsible for teaching a student like this? Thank you. Everybody, all day, every day. This is everybody's responsibility. The learning specialist can't do it. The SLP can't do it in 20 minutes once a week. And the classroom teacher has to be very involved in coordinating with those other professionals to align and coordinate what is taught to this kid and to reinforce and give all the extra practice he needs to remember anything. And then if it were this day and age, he would have to, we're so interested in these standards, he'd have to, we say, gain access to the content presented in social studies and science and literature, so we'd have to figure out how to use technology or how to read some things to him or whatever, but that shouldn't replace the amount of time that it would take to teach him to make progress in basic reading. One of the things I'm afraid of with the Common Core is that if kids get to 3rd grade and they can't read like this, and we're encouraged to just read things aloud to them, that's that much more time that they're not being taught how to do any of this themselves. That's something you've really got to watch. Okay, so what components of instruction? Well, this kid needs everything. All those things on the language chart. He needs phonological awareness, phoneme grapheme mapping, blending and word reading. He needs vocabulary, all things about the organization of word meanings, multiple meanings, spatial temporal words, categories, inflectional morphemes. He needs to really work on sentence comprehension and sentence formulation, and then just following the logic of a passage that he's reading. This is all going to be very challenging for him. So I don't know what happened to Sam. I wish I could give you the end of that story, but I didn't see him again. I've just worried about him for years. Okay, now, let me say a couple of things about the specifics of instruction. With a student like this who obviously has a language processing problem and phonological weaknesses, what we have to do, and I mentioned it this morning, is really use the articulatory gesture of the speech sound production to anchor the student's understanding of what speech sounds are in the spoken word. And why should we care? Because you cannot learn how an alphabetic system represents speech unless you know what it is the symbols are representing. So for example, if I were teaching the sound ah, I would teach the keyword octopus. I would point out that when we say ah, our jaw is way low, our mouth is wide open. I would call it the doctor sound because it's what the doctor wants you to say when he or she wants to look in the back of your throat. And you have to be wide open to say ah, and then I would maybe give a gesture, and the gesture that we use is this. This is the octopus swimming through the water. It only has 5 legs, but don't worry about that. So we go ah, and then we say, okay, when we go like this, what do you say? Good. Now I'm going to say a sound, and you make the gesture. Ready, everybody? Ah, bravo. Okay, good. And that's what we mean by multisensory instruction. We have a picture, we have a gesture, we have a reference to what the articulators are doing when the speech sound is made, and then we're going to associate it with the letter O and teach how those closed syllable patterns work. So in order to do that, you, as the teacher, have to know what the speech sound system is about and how it is organized. And let me focus on the vowels. Okay, I said with Sam that for every time there was the sound eh in a word, he wrote the letter A. Now, one way you can look at that is to say, oh, he just has a lousy, quote, visual memory, and so the letter A is his default vowel, and he just sticks it in anywhere. Well, it wasn't quite that random. It was very systematic. But why would he confuse, and my take on it is, he didn't know the difference between ah and eh as speech sounds that are confusable because the place of articulation in the mouth is so close. And one of the things we do all the time with teachers when we do professional development, and whether they're special ed or regular ed, is teach them how the vowels in English work. It's a matter of the placement of the tongue and the articulators. And my apologies to the SLPs who use a different vowel system, but the way I do this is starting up here, E. If you watch what my mouth is doing as I say these vowels, you can see the mouth open and then close up. So watch. E, a, I, o, oo. And then oi and ow are banished to the corner because they are diphthongs, and I know, you guys, that I is also a diphthong, but the reason I is on there for the teaching of phonics is that the spellings for the long vowels follow a pattern that includes I, whereas these diphthongs, oi and ow, are a special case for spelling. So to some extent, and those of you who've always wondered why I did it this way, it's because I want this to be useful for teaching reading and spelling. It's not exactly the way you'd find it in a linguistics text. So for example, often in a linguistics text you put and ah maybe sort of in the middle, or you put before which is okay. But this allows us to then put the spellings of each of these vowels. Okay, I went back to the consonants. So the same thing applies for consonants. If you know that certain consonants are confusable by virtue of their articulation, whether they are voiced or unvoiced, whether they are articulated in the same place in the mouth or in the same manner, you can then look at kids' spelling with a phonological eye. And this is what I wish all school psychologists would learn. I want every SLP in this room to find a friend who's a school psychologist and sit down and teach them how the speech sounds work. Because the psychologists' evaluations would be far more focused on what the kids actually are and are not processing as indicated in their spelling. Okay, so with and the place of articulation is so close. With you can get one little fingertip in your mouth, and with you can get the whole finger in your mouth, but they're very close in articulation. So here we have a kid with a phonological issue who really is, he doesn't know what that vowel sound is in the sense of being able to pull it out of the speech sound stream and distinguish from . It's a very subtle distinction. So we'd have to gradually build up his ability to do that. And here's where the refinements come in. That this morning I was talking about the Common Core. The Common Core in no way gives you any kind of specific information about how you would approach things like wide contrast versus narrow contrast in instruction. The rationale for teaching E before for example, instead of teaching and I and at the same lesson, which you often see in programs that think that reading is just a visual exercise and are totally oblivious to the phonological challenges of kids like Sam. Okay, so again, this quote from Alvin Liberman, he's the one who taught me years ago that the reason these confusions occur is that the existence of the speech sound is obscured by the speech stream. So when I say, okay, let's do some phoneme grapheme mapping, in the word chalk, the k at the end of that word is not articulated with the same emphasis as k in the word keep. And if you put it in the word skill, the k is not articulated with the same push of breath as it is in the word keep, because it's the second sound in a blend. So I know those things now, and I would then order my instruction to recognize that certain speech sounds in certain places in words are more difficult than others. And I would gradually build the student's ability to detect the presence of a sound in a word. So, okay, this is a little further down the road. If we've done a good job teaching speech sound awareness, and notice that what I'm talking about is the identity of sounds and the differentiation of sounds. It's not just segmentation and blending a la Dibbles. Because teachers fudge it all the time, and they teach kids how to segment 3 sounds, but the kids still may not have in focus the identity of those sounds and the relationships among the sounds. And I'm an advocate for things like the phonographics approach, for example, that start by teaching kids awareness of the sounds, and then they anchor the letters and graphemes to the sounds. So one way to do this also is the phoneme grapheme mapping process. Catherine Grace has done a nice little instructional manual on how you do this. By the way, all these slides are going to be available to you guys, so and the videotape and all that, so you can't write fast enough. Phoneme grapheme mapping is a process of taking a grid like this. It looks like math paper, right? And each box stands for a speech sound. And what we do with kids is explain how the English system works by taking a word, and suppose we're teaching, this is kind of a hodgepodge of things here, but suppose we're teaching the mapping of common digraphs. And we have the word chalk, and we say, okay, what's the word chalk? How are the sounds? Ch, ak. If there are 3 sounds, we need 3 boxes because the letters are going to represent the sounds. And then we need the letters to go in a box, and what will we put in the first box for the sound? Ch. So the kids write the CH, and then the second sound is ch. Ah. Is that the octopus sound, or the echo sound, or the up sound? Octopus. Yes, it's an O. And then the last sound is k. And what do we know about spelling k right after a short vowel? We spell it with CK. All right, so we can either show the kids the word and have them map it, or when they get better at the construction we're teaching, we can give them practice using the grid and having them figure it out. What I want to show with this, though, is this basic principle that English works by phoneme grapheme correspondence rather than letter-sound correspondence. And one of my beefs with some of the older Orton Gillingham approaches is that they tend to focus too much on single letters, and they need to do more with graphemes or letter groups that represent speech sounds. That's the big revision that needs to take place. So IGH, is a letter, IGH is a 3-letter grapheme. It's 3 letters that represent the sound I in a limited set of Old Anglo-Saxon words. In its Germanic origin, people would say Knecht in 1360 or whenever that was. Knecht, just like German. But now we say night. So we're stuck with the spelling. We're sorry about that. I will say to kids, I'm sorry about that. Judge, why did I put DGE in one box? Because it stands for one sound, J, right? And no word in English ends in a plain J, just like no word in English ends in a plain V. So we have these spelling conventions that deal with that. And when the word ends in J, we either use GE or DGE. We use DGE right after a short vowel. In the bathroom, somebody said, I never knew that before. I was very happy. It's in the bathroom that you really learn how your talk's going over. All right, then this morning I was expressing some dismay that in the Common Core, all of these aspects of word structure are kind of blithely referred to as something kids ought to know by 2nd or 3rd grade, and really word study doesn't need to happen much after that. And what I want to replace that idea with is that if kids really know how the language works, we could have a word study curriculum that goes certainly through 6th or 7th grade that teaches them about the Anglo-Saxon layer, the Latin layer, and the Greek layer of English, and then each level of representation, sound symbol relationships, syllable patterns, and morpheme structures that have originated with each of those layers of language. Marcia Henry was my mentor in learning and understanding about the relationship between word origin and word spelling. And why should we bother? Suppose we have kids who are dyslexic. Would this just be overwhelming to them to be taught this? Well, it turns out that no. The reason that we need to teach, especially to dyslexic kids, but I think all kids ought to know this, is that it gives them a conceptual handle for understanding that print should make sense. That there is a reason why we spell things the way we do. And it gives them a sense of hope beyond just rote memory, that they may be able to figure out sometimes how to spell something or how to look it up or how one word differs from another, even if they're not going to be good spellers. We want to include in our lessons in-depth study of word meanings. Marianne Wolf has shown that if you start very early with kids, and she works with kids at the 5th percentile, the really rottenest readers she can find, and teaches them multiple meanings right from the beginning, and has little books with these multiple meanings in them for the kids to read. Words like dig and jam, words like run. Some of the most common words we teach kids have lots of different meanings. If you enrich the semantic network, if you will, around multiple meanings, that facilitates word retrieval and fluency in those poor readers. So that's another reason why her particular program, which is called RAVO, is very effective with really poor readers who have fluency problems, especially as a supplement to something like reading mastery. And then I talked this morning about sentences and building sentence sense. There are lots of ways to do that. I would say, though, that I think that the teaching of grammar has gotten short shrift. With Steve Graham's meta-analyses, I really admire his work, but the fact is that the research base for understanding how to teach syntax and grammar in a way that does lead to better reading comprehension and writing, the research base is slim. One of the better people to read is Cheryl Scott, she's the one who says sentences do the work of the text. And she talks specifically, I think SLPs have more access to her work, but she talks specifically about the syntactic constructions that are problematic for kids with language-based learning difficulties. And for you teachers who have had no course in language, this is something that you need to learn, because if you're teaching reading comprehension, as I illustrated this morning with that sentence from Black Beauty, if you're teaching that and you can anticipate that that sentence is going to be really difficult for your kids and have a strategy in mind for how to break that down and how to help the kids find the main noun and the main verbs, or how to get them to unravel the complex verb forms in there, you'll be way ahead of the game. So you don't want to wait until the kids don't get it. You want to set them up to get it by rehearsing them on those kinds of constructions ahead of time. I showed this morning. No, I won't do that. Okay, so comprehension depends on active processing of language at many levels, and particularly features of academic language that are going to be challenging, especially for kids who have language comprehension problems like Sam, right? So if we were teaching Sam, we'd have to pause on the figurative language, multiple meanings, the formalities of academic language, the references in the text, the paragraph structures, where's the main idea, and all of that. So we could not help Sam in 20 minutes a day in the resource room. It just wouldn't matter, because his problems are so pervasive and affect every aspect of reading that it takes teamwork and coordination and a lot of time and a lot of patience to help him become functionally literate. This is a kid at the 3rd percentile, beginning of 3rd grade, having repeated. You know, we want him to get to middle school at least being able to read at a 3rd grade level, which would be accomplishing a lot. Okay, so traditional Orton-Gillingham for a student like Sam would be necessary but not sufficient because of all the language involvement that he has. And I already said this, so it would include teaching all the strands of language, plus some accommodations, plus some books on tape, some print-to-speech translation supports, some compensatory strategies, some shortcuts, and then developing his strengths. This kid is going to do something mechanical. He's just really good at it. Puzzles, block designs, whether it's putting things together, repairing things, drawing things. I don't know where he ended up, but he had very definite strengths that deserved to be nurtured in his educational program as well. When we talk about OG, Orton-Gillingham, or structured language approaches, there are a number of them out there to choose from, and they're all sort of suited for different settings and different types of groups of kids. The International Dyslexia Association has a long list of them, and there are more all the time. This is just a limited list. I'd add to this the Herman method as well. But beyond Orton-Gillingham, there are also many validated programs and therapies and approaches that are definitely effective with certain populations of kids. No doubt about it. Linda Mood Bell. That's not OG, but lots of research shows the effectiveness of lips and visualizing and verbalizing. The rewards approach of Anita Archer, especially for just teaching kids to read multisyllabic words in the intermediate grades and on up. Direct instruction methodologies are powerful, and the data have always been there to support the efficacy of reading mastery and related programs. Wolf's Ravo program, Maureen Lovett in Canada has a program she's done research with. I don't think it's published. Judith Hochman's writing program, and Language Live, which is now the hybrid program, some of which is delivered online and some of which is delivered by the teacher. Whoops, go ahead. Okay, so here's another. Now, I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in the works here. This is a second grader. Her mother contacted me on the internet. That happens quite a bit. She said, "Dear Dr. Motes, do you know anything about surface dyslexia?" And I said, "Well, I think the British talk about this a lot. And it means that the student is good at sounding things out but can't develop habits for words." So the parent wrote back and said, "That's my kid." So I've gotten to know this student sort of over the internet, and her mom sends me pictures and writing samples, and we keep track of what's happening at school and trying to get instruction for her. So the child wrote me this letter. "Dear Dr. Motes, when I read, I want to scream. When I read in my head, I get a headache. Sometimes when I get my spelling test back in my folder, I cry because I missed so many words. In math, science, and art, I love and I do good at. My favorite thing to do at home is art." And then she sent me the test results, the vocabulary score at the 98th percentile, full scale IQ at the 90th percentile, listening comprehension 98th percentile, word reading 16th percentile, gray oral reading 16th percentile, the OWLS test 20th percentile, the Woodcock reading mastery, word ID 16th percentile, and spelling the 12th percentile. Is this student dyslexic is the fight we're having. Yes. She cannot read or spell. It gives her a headache. She sits at the dining room table with her mother and practices her spelling words over and over and over again, and doesn't do very well. I will show you in a minute. But the point of debate here is that she is accurate on the CTOP. In other words, she can do phoneme awareness. She can decode the single sound symbol relationships. What she cannot do is described in that definition of dyslexia from the Netherlands. She cannot develop automatic habits for word recognition and for spelling. And this is what really got me. The spelling test, -15. This is a kid, you see how bright she is, how hardworking. There are no behavior problems. She wants to learn. She cannot get it. And she has studied. And they're telling me in this other state that this student doesn't have dyslexia because she did well on phoneme segmentation. So do all dyslexic people have phonological deficits? Now, so we have to look to research. And one source is Nancy Mather's book on dyslexia. It's excellent, and she discusses orthographic processing problems. Stanislaus Dehaan's book, Reading in the Brain, 2009, outstanding book. He quotes an eminent European researcher, Frank Ramus. Quote, "A core deficit in phonological processing lies at the origin of most dyslexia, but about 1 in 4 presents a pronounced visual orthographic deficit and no phonological impairment. The problem that faces us is complex and does not have a single well-defined cause. It's a joint deficit of vision and language." And I've then since done a search of the scientific literature on orthographic problems in dyslexia, and this finding is confirmed by anybody who's taken a really close look. And the current issue of Scientific Studies of Reading, with that lead article by Margaret Snowling and colleagues, also reiterates this. And think about it. How many people do you know who have poor phonology but who can read? Okay, my husband's one of them. He cannot pronounce words, and he reads like a whiz. How did Helen Keller learn to read? How does anybody with do you know anyone who is like this child, who has excellent phonology and who cannot read and spell? Yes. If you've been around long enough, you've seen these cases. So we must give credence to these neuropsychological models that tell us that dyslexia can affect one or more of these processing systems and their interconnections, and we cannot buy into an overly simple-minded definition that requires all kids to have similar profiles. It's just not, it's not consistent with science. So what will we do for this lovely little girl that's different from what we would do for Sam? Well, we have to establish sight word habits, that automatic recognition of words. And we have to teach a few words at a time. We have to limit her spelling list to very few words, and we have to use a lot of multisensory repetition to have her trace those words, say the letters, and write those words over and over. If she learns 2 sight words a week, great. And then she'll gradually improve the number that she can remember as her orthographic processor develops some word images. She needs to review often, or she'll forget. She needs also the logic of English spelling so she has a conceptual handle on the language and something to solve the spelling problems with, a strategy. She needs to do a lot of word sorting to enhance her visual attention to the patterns in print. So computer-based practice might be very good for her. The little games where the kids have to increase their automaticity and just recognizing a word, a target word in an array. She doesn't need phoneme segmentation. and she doesn't need language comprehension. So it turns out, actually, if you look at the standardization of fluency tests, that kids who are really fluent read with 97 to 98% accuracy. They don't make errors in word recognition. That's very interesting to me because we traditionally in reading have talked about 95% accuracy in reading being perfectly okay. Well, good readers really don't make mistakes unless they're totally unfamiliar with an odd word. But fluency is acquired word by word. So if you're working on fluency and you're doing it with passages only, you need to augment what you're doing and focus at the word level, words, phrases, and text. I'm going to skip over a few of these slides on the brain, but here is, this is a slide I got from Jack Fletcher, who's at the University of Texas. He's at the University of Houston now. He was a colleague of mine on our big research study. So he sends me slides. And this one is good because it shows, remember that schematic diagram of the brain that I showed earlier? And this one shows that a good reader, or low risk, that means a kid who can read, you can see the activation here in the phonological processor, and this is where phonology and these visual images of words get paired up right here. So lots of activation there, and some in the right hemisphere as well, some complementary activation back here. And then this high-risk responder, that is the kid who is responding to instruction, you can see how they're starting to develop this word recognition, or this place where sounds and letters are matched up. And how this is a high-risk kid, and it's interesting here, there's a lot of complementary activity in the right hemisphere that doesn't go on for a good reader. We're not sure what that's about. And this is the kid who is not responding to instruction. Nothing happening there. So and lots of complementary activity in the right hemisphere. I think that you know the right hemisphere activation patterns, we don't know what that's about. It's as if the wrong hemisphere of the brain is trying to read. Okay. All right, let's talk about assessment. Because there's a lot of difference of opinion about what we need to do to assess kids who have reading disabilities. And I did have all that background in neuropsychology and clinical work, and used to subject kids to hours of testings and so on. I have come to the opinion that we need to do much less testing and much more teaching. We need to take, yes. And while it's nice to have a comprehensive evaluation with every test in the book to give you a profile of a kid's strengths and weaknesses, the heart of the matter is whether they can read and spell. So the basic test battery is reading single words out of context, timed and untimed, reading nonsense words out of context, timed and untimed, a survey of whether they can tell you what the letter-sound relationships are, whether they can read words with more than one syllable, a dictated spelling test that samples, that's a survey of what they know about spelling patterns, a writing sample, vocabulary test, and if necessary, if you suspect that the student has real language deficits, you need to go a little further and do either refer to the SLP or at least do a listening comprehension test where you compare what the student can do. I mean, you can sorry, this is heresy, but you can take the gray oral and read the passages aloud and see if the student can answer the questions, and that's different from having them read them themselves. If you're a teacher in a classroom, that's the kind of thing I would try to do before deciding whether to refer a student. Meanwhile, if the student is struggling and has these symptoms of poor reading and poor spelling, just get after it right away. And I think we do much too much waiting around for, all these other things to be done. So we want to do a CTOP, and we want to do a RAND test, and we want to do a working memory assessment, and related orthographic processing. Wait a minute, this student can't spell, okay? And know that I need to start teaching. These other things, I would say, should be used seldom, not routinely, because it's not necessary. And the more important thing is to find the kids who are at risk and falling behind in basic reading, spelling, and writing, and put your eggs in the basket of instruction and instructional time. Every hour you spend doing an expensive, involved assessment is an hour you are not spending teaching that student at a critical point of reading development. And I probably just made some people unhappy. Okay, so early identification. How do you know when you see one? Well, first you use a screener like Dibbles, just because it tells you who's at risk and who isn't within a big margin of error. So that's not the only thing. Then you have to do a phonics survey, and can the kids name the letters? And then you might do something that's not time consuming, like the test of word reading efficiency, and a dictated spelling test to supplement that if the kids haven't passed the screening. And then you ought to know enough to at least know how to begin instruction. The more involved assessments are necessary when the child is not responding to instruction, when the child is unusually complex, when you think that multiple services are needed, the student is likely candidate for special education. But most of this instruction has to be done with kids who are not going to qualify for special education. If only 5% of these kids get into special education, and at least 20 to 30% are, quote, struggling readers, you've got many more who need expert informed instruction to prevent their reading problems from escalating and getting worse and worse over time, as this chart shows. When kids are in the lower 20%, they tend to go that way, and the kids who are in the middle 50% tend to go that way, and to close that gap is extremely difficult by the time they get to 5th or 6th grade, and is seldom done. So if you have preschool kids, what should you do? Somebody asked me this already. The first thing you do is notice how the kids are behaving and get a history. Is there a delay in speaking? Is there difficulty pronouncing words? Are they nonverbal? Can they rhyme? These are all things that a teacher can observe in a couple of weeks. Can they name things? When you teach them a letter name, do they remember it or not? Or do they act like they never saw it? Or they come up with the wrong association? Or the kids don't watch when you're reading the big book aloud, and they're looking out the window because they don't want to look at the print. Those are all signs of kids who are averse to print. And then you ask them to write their name in the alphabet, and if they start out looking like that, you have a lot of work to do. And even there, this one knows more of the alphabet and can write Daddy, Mommy, Anna, and then fills up the rest of the page. There is a screening test that's okay that the National Center for Learning Disabilities has been funding and promoting for quite a while. It's online, it's free, and I forget the name of it, but you can easily find it for preschool. And then I think that spelling can tell you an awful lot. Here is a first grader spelling test, and the first grader writes red, name, bed, lady, okay, fish, men, boat, girl, color, angry, thank you, people, dog, and boy. So here's a student who pretty much gets the first sound, not always, and basically makes up the rest, but has an idea what words are supposed to look like. But beyond that, if you have a background in the speech sound system, you're going to notice that as words get longer, the student really kind of falls apart. The student is using letters as fillers, really has no idea what the letters are for, and probably has been taught about the beginning sounds in words, but not about any of the rest of it. This is a case study I have in the speech to print textbook that I have a real field day with, but it is absolutely typical of, say, this was a third grader with phonological problems that were apparent even without the C-top. So, whoops, I keep doing this the wrong way. Okay, so garage, the student spells garage with a CH and leaves out the R. The student spells the medial sound in items with an N, and it is a T. And how are those sounds related? They're both made with a tongue behind the teeth in the middle of the mouth. But they're not, one's a nasal, one is not. If you look down here, it's an apple, whoops, it's an apple tree point. So the student can't keep those liquids and nasals pinned down in the right place. Point, no N. Tree, the R migrates to the end of the word. Apple, the O migrates to the first syllable. And then in basement, there's no N in there. And there's another example, no N. Front, no N. And then basement, the student uses a P, and the sound is B. Those are phonological confusions because P is unvoiced and B is voiced. The student has, actually there are 3 or 4 examples of voicing confusions in this writing sample. So again, if you know phonology, you don't need the C-top to tell you what the student is confusing in the real act of reading and spelling. And that's where we need to bring we need to refine our diagnostic sensibilities to really look at what the student is doing and stay focused on that, rather than scores on tests that have only a mild to moderate correspondence with reading and spelling. This is a 16-year-old. I love this one. This is also to ground us in a reality here, which is we can work with dyslexic kids for many years, and still the problem is not cured. The perfect age, he was asked to write an essay, and he'd been taught to organize his paragraphs with topic, sentences, and details. So he writes, "The perfect age is to be 25 years old, because that is when you have a real girlfriend that is perfect for you, and hopefully she is pretty and nice. Also because you can pay less on car insurance and some other things. Some other reasons is so you can get a better job, make more money, have your own house and boat or whatever. Be famous at something. Reach your peak of most things. Also, get close to marriage and have kids. Forget everything bad that ever happened when you were younger and get engaged to the perfect girl for you. That's all I can think of. So I can't wait till I'm 25. All right. All right. So, what do we do about this? We teach linguistic concepts explicitly. We teach systematically, cumulatively. We use multisensory techniques for sound symbol correspondences and other kinds of language study, because there's something magical for kids about getting their hands on something they can manipulate or hold. The work has to be intensive, and this is something for all of you in the school district to think about. It would be better for you to have 90 minutes a day for the 6th graders than to have 45 minutes a day, because you would probably see more than twice the gain with twice the amount of time. By the time kids are that old and they're that far behind, you're just pretty much treading water and coping if you're only spending 45 minutes a day working on these problems. Joe Torgeson's studies showed actually that 90 minutes a day starting in 3rd grade was what was necessary to start closing that gap between the kids at the 20th percentile and the kids at the 50th percentile. So the multisensory aspect of instruction is further down on my list than some people who talk about dyslexia like to talk about. So they often talk about multisensory structured language teaching, but the problem with that is it's the structured language teaching that's really important, and the multisensory characteristic is also important, but multisensory teaching can occur with material that is not systematic and cumulative or informative. And I would say, for example, there are activities on making words that are out there that are not systematic, explicit, and cumulative, even though they are multisensory in the sense that kids are pushing letters around while they make words. So you have to be careful what you're doing. There are programs that say, oh, this is a phonics program, but there's no scope and sequence. There's no cumulative practice. So all these characteristics are really important. And why? Because these kids forget. If you don't build it like bricks into a wall, they'll forget. Okay, we've talked about this. So what does a multi-component lesson framework look like? Well, unless you're the little girl I showed, you're going to do a sound warm-up or a listening task. You're going to explicitly teach the concept for the day. You're going to model. You're going to give guided practice. Of course, anyone from the University of Oregon knows this. Model, lead, practice. You're going to give independent practice. Once the kids get it, you're going to apply it in context. That's the element of instructional design that's so important here. You're going to do some aspect of phoneme-grapheme mapping, really for any kind of dyslexia. The kids need to understand how graphemes represent phonemes. You're going to have a fluency component in your lesson, and that may involve speed drills or repeated readings or partner work. There are lots of ways to do that. You're going to build vocabulary and word meanings. You're going to do oral and silent text reading for comprehension, including sentence-level work. And you're going to include spelling and writing. So if you do all of this, this requires time. There's just no shortcut. I'm sorry. Reading should be meaningful. I used to be affiliated with the Greenwood School in that we taught a summer program for teachers called the Greenwood Institute, and one of the former teachers from Greenwood was here this morning, Heather. Oh, hi there. Heather was a teacher there. And what I learned from watching the teachers at work in this great school, which, by the way, will be featured in a Ken Burns film shown in April, coming up, don't miss it, on the Gettysburg Address. All these kids had to learn the Gettysburg Address and memorize it and recite it in a public forum and be judged on who delivered the best Gettysburg Address. And these are all kids with learning disabilities and dyslexia, or a lot of them with dyslexia. But they were reading Shakespeare stories. They were reading quality text. And what I learned from watching this was that with the supports and with the intensive tutorials and with the kind of thoughtful, deliberate teaching that went on there, the kids could deal with conceptually challenging material and worthwhile text. So this is something that I think should come as a consequence of the Common Core, that we'll figure out more about the use of higher quality text for our kids with learning disabilities. And I love this quote from Anna Quinlan: through books we experience other times, other places, other lives. We manage to become much more than our own selves. And that has to be true for our kids with learning challenges, as well as our kids who learn more easily. But I hope what I'm leaving you with is the idea that we need to adapt what we do for the characteristics of the learner, and keep in mind these well-grounded theoretical models and current research for thinking about the possible kind of subgroups that we have within our dyslexic population and our other kids with reading disorders that are based mainly in language comprehension. So we've got to start early. We've got to label the problem accurately. And again, the label carries so much meaning that is helpful. Just to say that someone is dyslexic, it's such a relief to the individual to know that there is a word for this. There are journals about it. There are books. There are people who know about it. There are researchers working all over the world to understand it. And it's such a relief. And it's so different from saying you have a reading problem, or you're a tier 2, or you're a tier 3. That's not informative. It doesn't link you to sources of information. We have to certainly use technology for compensation. If kids don't read, we have to get them to read. This is the hardest part, right? You can teach them how to read, but then to get them to read is really tough. And this is the old chart that we had in the Reading First materials from Richard Anderson et al., showing that if someone reads at the 10th percentile in 5th grade, they read about 50,000 words per year. If they read at the 50th percentile in 5th grade, they read about 600,000 words a year. So average students receive approximately 10 times as much practice in a year just looking at print. And that's a phenomenal difference, and something that is so, and this is why we cannot replace the actual teaching of reading with reading aloud to kids. Because the more you read aloud to them, the less text exposure they're getting. Now, they may be building their ability to listen, then that's fine. And if you want to have non-readers who are good listeners, that's where that will end up. So I want to conclude by reading you something. All right, Philip Schultz is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. How many of you know this book? A few, all right. Whoops. Okay, it's called My Dyslexia. Philip Schultz won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 2009. And in 2011, he wrote a book. And you can see that the book is small and short. And just listen to this. The act of translating what, for me, are the mysterious symbols of communication into actual comprehension has always been a hardship to me. I often read a sentence 2 or 3 times before I truly understand it, must restructure its syntax and sound out its syllables before I can begin to absorb its meaning and move on to the next sentence. And when I make the mistake of becoming aware that I am reading and behaving in a way that enables this mysterious electrically charged process to take place, my mind balks and goes blank, and I become anxious and stop. For reasons I'll never fully understand, or perhaps don't even want to, I dislike the peculiar, obstinate, slightly out of control way in which my mind behaves when I'm reading. I can never just sit down and begin reading. I must first trick myself into it by playing endless games of solitaire on my computer, or reheating my tea, or taking another walk with my dog, Penelope, who always seems to know from the odd noises I make that this one activity may soon lead to the other that so pleases her. But once I'm actually reading, once I've convinced myself that it's in my best interest to engage in this struggle, I proceed haltingly at first, hesitating at the beginning of each new thought and sentence, as if accruing additional strength and courage. And while reading, I must sell myself a bill of goods, convince myself that what I'm reading is so fascinating and valuable, so compelling, that it's worth the effort. I must remind myself at regular intervals that having to constantly reread sentences is both sensible and necessary, an act of self-discipline, fortitude, and concentration that ultimately will benefit me not only as a person, but as a writer. This argument, and it is an argument, isn't always easy to buy into, and sometimes I quit out of frustration and exhaustion. My son's verbal comprehension was scored at the 99th percentile on the Wechsler, where he demonstrated an exceptional facility in coming up with category names and an extraordinary rich fund of words. And I would imagine that I share this facility, which helps me compensate for the problems I have with word retrieval and identifying common concepts. I often forget the meanings of words I've looked up many times before and must consult a dictionary, as I frequently consult a thesaurus while writing to make sure I've selected the right word. As I read, a kind of subtle bartering between uncertainty and hunger for knowledge goes on in my mind, in which I must conquer a feeling of hopelessness and anxiety. I've learned to read the way a runner learns to expect and find his second and third wins, the way an athlete pushes himself beyond where it's comfortable to go. I read word by word, sometimes congratulating myself on the completion of each sentence, each paragraph and chapter. Perhaps this is why it's particularly hard for me to read anything that isn't well written and moving, why I became a poet, because poetry is so compressed and is often beautifully written and moving. So, to summarize, learning to read is very complex, and there's no single cause for dyslexia and related reading disabilities that we know of. No single profile that characterizes every individual. However, most students are going to respond to a multi-component approach that's deeply informed by a knowledge of language. We have to assess and treat this problem directly and use processing tests to help explain the student's strengths in particular, but not as a gateway to services in most cases. We have to rely on structured language approaches for intervention and train the teachers in how to use them. And we have to look for and develop compensatory student strengths. And finally, I would say, the other area in which I've done most of my work is in teacher training, because I myself knew nothing about any of this for years and had no way of helping the students who came to me who had reading disabilities, and I still remember them. So if we could put much more emphasis on educating our teachers and helping them understand. Most teachers who get this information about language and who are given the tools to teach directly and to help their students are absolutely overjoyed that they're finally equipped with something that actually works and enables them and their student to feel successful. And I would just urge you, the powers that be here, to please focus on that and be less bound up with debates about definitions and assessments and so on, and become as focused as you can on how you actually help someone and teach someone with this very common condition. So I thank you so much for being here. Actually, I think we have 5 minutes for, did you want to say something right now? I mean, if there are any quick questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm a psychologist, but I'm also the mother of a 14-year-old, and he has, I work at the University of Oregon, so you can only imagine how much intervention his dyslexic child has had. But if we fight one battle, it's half the thing. Reading. He just hates to read. It's hard. School is hard all day long. Homework takes 4 times as long. And it's this common pattern. What do we say? I mean, at the end of all of that, do we put this out, okay, with 20 minutes of reading in no matter what? Or where do you draw that line when you get to like a high school student?
I think you have to take it case by case. If the student is, if your student is pulling his hair out, threatening to jump off a bridge, I think for so many kids with dyslexia, the anxiety and frustration that this condition promotes is so profound and so debilitating. At some point, you just have to use your judgment as a mom or as a teacher to say, enough already, I'm not going to push it anymore. I'm going to enable my student to adapt, cope, use compensatory strategies, and find another way of making a living. He's going to be a snowboard champion, he's going to paint cars, he's going to be a landscape artist, he's going to design bicycles. There are lots of things, and this is the sort of dirty little secret. When we look at the case studies of people who've been through these specialized schools and everything, I think in lots of them, they find other ways of being successful in life. So once they get the heck out of school, life becomes much easier. The worst years of their life are in school. So you have to just judge how much tolerance does this person have for any more pressure or any more, ultimatums about what you have to do. And I would read the Philip Schultz book and look at the biographies of these very accomplished people in the world who really cannot read and write, or who never could do math, or whatever it is. Some of them are very good detectives. There are lots of ways. We're so narrow-minded in education, and that's one of my issues with the Common Core is, who the heck thinks that we ought to have a uniform standard for everybody? It's a kind of tyranny. It's nice to have it, but whether everybody ought to actually attain it, I have my doubts. That we ought to be punishing people in one way or another who don't attain it. I know too much about individual differences and about success in life, and part of what we have to do is have individuals who are not burdened with unbearable anxiety and frustration. So that's all the help I can give you. Thank you for asking. Okay. Okay. No, don't feel guilty. Yes. Jim, answer? Yes? We have an answer.
Hello, my name's Dr. Tim Copad. I'm a psychologist with Portland Public Schools, and the PowerPoint should be available hopefully within the week on our special education public site. So you should be able to get a hold of that as soon as it's available and download that. My other announcement was to also let people know that if you're a speech pathologist and need, I think it's ASHA credit, then to make sure that you turn in the form to Loretta Manning out in the foyer. So we are out of time. So I want to thank, first of all, Dr. Moats for joining us today. Wow. And additionally, I want to thank all of our partners who helped make this all happen. And so it took a lot of different people to come together and contribute, and it was just really helpful. So.